Okay, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak and speak first at this conference. And thank you very much, colleagues, for speaking in English as well. I will also speak in English, my only language. I am talking about the protection of cultural property in armed conflict and the Blue Shield. As introduced, am the elected president of the Blue Shield, and I do speak on behalf of the Blue Shield. However, you'll see at the bottom of all of my slides two logos. The other is that I hold the chair in Cultural Property Protection and Peace at Newcastle University, a UNESCO designation, the only such chair in the world. But I have to say, at UNESCO's insistence, that I do not work for nor speak for UNESCO. UNESCO chairs are a critical friend to UNESCO, and occasionally I'm told I may be a little too critical. I also apologize for one of the slides that I'm going to show you, but it emphasizes the point I'm trying to make better than 10,000 words. Also, just to start off, I'm going to be talking about cultural property during much of the presentation. That's probably an antiquated term developed in the 1950s and late 1940s. But when I say cultural property or cultural property protection, CPP, please think about tangible and intangible heritage and cultural and natural heritage, because actually there is almost no natural heritage on the planet, if any. All natural heritage has been influenced by humans and used by humans in different ways. So please think about those as we go on. And that type of understanding speaks to a community relationship, and community is one of the things I'm going to emphasize in these next slides. So the issue that brings us together here is that cultural property is damaged and destroyed during armed conflict, following natural disaster, and can be and frequently is an issue for peacekeeping operations. That's not new, but it is something that we need to address. And the stock answers that you can see on the screen there, and I'm not going to read all of these out. I have got quite a lot of text on some of the slides. My presentation will be made available at the end if people want to follow it up. But those arguments that it's not a responsibility to protect cultural property during conflict, there are other more important things going on, is not, I think, necessarily true. So are those things true? No. Cultural property protection can be protected if the value of cultural property protection, CPP, is recognized in peacetime and the value of cultural property to conflict and peace is understood. It is not, though, an issue that can be left to the heritage sector alone. The heritage sector may drive it, may raise the profile, but it needs to be a cross-government and what we call in the Blue Shield cross-sector responsibility. And we identify three key sectors: the uniform sector, not only armed forces, but border, customs, police, emergency services, and the humanitarian sector. And those three, you will see, need to be able to work together for good cultural property protection. But let's just take a step back and ask why cultural property is actually important and why we are gathered here. It's important because it provides the tangible and intangible links for society to the past that helps individuals and communities with a sense of place, a sense of identity, belonging, and dignity. Yes, we must always put the protection of people first, but the protection of people is indivisibly intertwined with the protection of their cultural property. And it needs to be a key part of the thinking and the planning of those three sectors. And it helps, in Blue Shield language, to create or maintain healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities. And with those communities can come social understanding and social peace. And through that, we can begin to build world peace. But of course, CPP comes also with a health warning. It defines who people are, and therefore who belongs, but also contentiously who they are not, who is included, who is excluded, who belongs and who does not. It can be used, and we try and we gather here together to use it as a means of reconciliation and peace building. But it can also be used, and has frequently been used, as an excuse for war, as a legitimization of war, and as a target and weapon in war. And we must be aware of both sides of that dual-edged sword. And that's nothing new. Those ideas have been around for 2,500 years since the writings of Sun Shao. But it is something that we still need to address and we still need to work at, because we're not very good at it at the moment. And let me take us back just to the end of the Second World War to put some of this in a little bit of context. The international community was appalled at the failure of the royal families of Europe to stop the First World War before it had started, or stop it by Christmas, or as early as possible. And many of those royal families, because of their failures, disappeared at the end of the First World War and were replaced internationally by an organization called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, and I'm being, in a lot of what I say this morning, grossly oversimple, but the League of Nations was there and created to develop world peace through diplomacy, through economic means, and through an overall reduction in armaments. And the League completely failed, as we all know, to stop the development of the Second World War. So during the end of the Second World War, the international community came together and said, okay, so what did we get wrong with the League? And the bit that had been missing in their view, and this is a group of people who had lived through both world wars, was the failure to understand the importance of culture, and as they say, humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity built from that culture. And so in the preface to the replacement organization, the United Nations, that emphasis is put very firmly in the preamble to the Constitution. And they also developed a specialized agency for the UN, UNESCO, to build peace through education, science, and culture. And a lot of that thinking was, had been developed and was propagated by writings from the 1930s onwards by one man, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who was studying massacres in the past, and who actually decided that there wasn't a word strong enough to explain what had happened. And so Lemkin created the word genocide and put the two, a Latin and a Greek word together to create that. And in the early drafts of the 1948 Genocide Convention, Lemkin had two chapters, one on barbarism, the genocide against population, against people, and one on vandalism, genocide against those populations' cultural property. Unfortunately, in the last iteration, the final draft of the 48 Convention, that was insisted to be taken out, vandalism as a concept, by the so-called settler countries, America, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, supported by the UK, perhaps as ever. But the idea was out of the box. The idea was there. And so senior Nazis at the Nuremberg trials were predominantly convicted of crimes against barbarism, as Lemkin would have said, but some of them were also convicted of crimes of vandalism as defined by Lemkin. It's there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Access to culture and cultural property is a universal human right. And it was there very much at the beginning of the thinking of those who sat down to develop probably the last of the post-war great conventions, the 1954 Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. And the then Director General of UNESCO, opening the final sessions of the drafting of that, said, "Gentlemen," and they all were gentlemen in the room, but gentlemen, we are here together not only to draft the words of a convention, but to create a new organization. And let me call it, he said, the Red Cross for cultural property. And in the following debates over the next few months, that organization had a concept created around it and a name given to it, the name the Blue and White Shield, for reasons obvious at the bottom of the slides. Unfortunately, that organization was not created in 1954. And I will come back to it in a moment. But I'm going to literally gallop through a few reasons as to why we need to take this seriously from all three of the perspectives of those three sectors, the uniformed, humanitarian, and heritage sectors. I'm not going to read all of those out. I will flag them as I go through the individual slides. And this is the slide that I apologize for. But in the fighting in former Yugoslavia, the population of the village of Brocko were rounded up and taken about a mile away from their village. And they were put at the side of a large trench that had just been dug out of the ground, and they were machine gunned into the ground. But the trench was not filled up by the earth that had been taken out to dig the trench. Instead, the remains of the village's mosque were brought to the same place and filled in. So you have the population and their cultural property, their religious cultural property, buried in the same grave. And back in the village, the mosque was destroyed to the level, as an archaeologist I would say, it was taken down to natural. So there is no way an archaeologist could go at any point in the future and say there had been a building there, let alone identify it as a mosque. You can't get a clearer indication of the indivisibility of the relationship between barbarism and vandalism than that slide. But that is not new. Those things had happened in the past, and they continued afterwards. And the treatment by the so-called Islamic State of the Yazidi, where they purposefully targeted the population, but also purposefully targeted and destroyed their cultural property and their religious property, again predominantly, carries on. We've all thought that the Islamic State has disappeared, but actually there are still fairly large areas of the Middle East under the Islamic State's control. And as given to me a few weeks ago as an estimate, there are still over 2,000 Yazidi women and girls being used as sexual slaves in those areas still controlled by the so-called Islamic State. So this issue has not gone away. There are numerous legal issues, and I'm not going to go through all of these, you will be relieved to know, but I want to point out that they are not only international humanitarian law, but they are international criminal law with the Rome Statute that created the international ICC, International Criminal Court, sorry, and they are international customary law. So even if countries haven't ratified some of these, they are still held responsible under international customary law. And they are also built into the mandates of UN peacekeeping operations and others as they work around the world. So there is a significant legal basis to CPP. Thirdly, the political agenda, and I've already touched on this, but whenever a conflict happens, those who are sent to fight the conflict, because don't forget the military don't decide to go to war, they are sent to war by politicians. The military need to know how cultural property is going to be used by their politicians and the enemy's politicians in that fighting, because that may influence not only strategic but operational and tactical activity on the ground. The fourth issue is looting, and looting has become an endemic problem. The first people to be identified as specifically looting archaeological sites for financial gain were the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet Union in the 1970s in Afghanistan. And they realized that there was a lot of money to be had in looting archaeological sites, selling it on the black market, and then using the funds to propagate the conflict. And others have learnt from that, which led to the UN Security Council Resolution 2347 about the protection of cultural property. So looting is a key aspect. If anybody tells you they know how much money is made from looting, they are not lying, but they are being economical with the truth, let's say, because nobody knows. We won't know until the likes of the Mujahideen and the so-called Islamic State fill in tax returns, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. But it is a lot of money, and a lot of that money goes to the continuation of conflict. The fifth issue is that cultural property is needed for post-conflict stabilization. So the images on the slide there, first one is the 16th century mosque destroyed in Banja Luka during the conflict, but then rebuilt as a statement that we are still here, that we are still living, and we are still a population. An attempt to slowly stabilize a post-conflict situation. Another example from South Africa, where the political prison on Robben Island has now been turned into a center for peace and reconciliation. None of these things are going to be quick fixes, but if we don't start them soon, they will never begin. The sixth issue, the potential economic value of cultural property in the future. And again, you see here the restored National Museum in Baghdad on its first day of opening. There is now a steady trickle of Iraqis going to the museum, building up that economic base. And soon, hopefully, there will be a much more substantial international groups going to there. And then finally, I want to just emphasize the potential for the use of cultural property protection as a military and political advantage. And the best example I can give is in 1917, when the British were fighting the Ottomans in North Africa. And it became apparent that in a few months, in a few weeks, and in a few days, that the British were going to take control of Jerusalem. And depending on your opinion, they were going to liberate it, occupy it, or conquer it. And the Ottoman Empire was already putting out PR information that the Brits were, this war was not a war between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, but a war between Christianity and Islam. And that worried Allenby, the commanding officer, because 95% of the population of Jerusalem was Islamic. And he was very worried about the possibility of resistance to a British occupation. If it worried Allenby, it terrified the British politicians, because they were concerned for the possibility of that spreading across, that resistance spreading across the Middle East and potentially spreading to British India, opening a third front in the First World War and potentially threatening the financial hub of the British Empire. So Allenby did two things. He walked into Jerusalem to show that he was coming as a friend, but he also gave out a proclamation that had been written for him by the politicians in London. And the most important bit is there on the slide. Every sacred building, monument, holy spot, shrine, traditional site of the three religions will be protected. And that was great. But then somebody on Allenby's staff turned really good CPP into excellent CPP, because they deployed, very simply, Indian Muslim troops under Allenby's command to protect the Islamic sites. And as a result of that, those three acts, there was no opposition from the 95% Islamic population of Jerusalem. Allenby could continue his very fast advance over North Africa, and the politicians could sigh with relief. Less good, perhaps, is much more recent. And predominantly, I'm talking of 2006, but in 2002, the Americans set up six so-called think tanks to plan for post-Saddam Iraq following the invasion. And one of those had a subcommittee on culture, which I am reliably informed never met. As a result of that, there were no political instructions to the military to protect cultural property. As a result of that, no forces were given orders to protect cultural property. As a result of that, there was the widespread looting of the National Museum, of the National Library, of the National Archive, and many other such institutions across the country. But then the tipping point of a population increasingly frustrated with the continuing presence of coalition troops came in 2006 with the attack on the Al-Shari Mosque in Samarra, one of the most holy shrines in Shia Islam. That was the tipping point into the full-scale sectarian civil war that Western politicians thought required the presence of coalition troops for a further 5 years, taking 5 years' worth of casualties, of fatalities, but even those are appalling, probably worse, spending 5 years losing the PR war. And as a result, that provided the position for the re-emergence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and it provided the oxygen for the emergence of the so-called Islamic State. So, 42 years late, the Blue Shield, now not called the Blue and White Shield, but simply the Blue Shield, arrived in 1996 in anticipation of the second protocol of the 54 Convention. And it was set up by 4 heritage organizations, and we now have an international branch and, at the moment, 32 national committees. And I hope to encourage, through my presence here, a thought process of the establishment of a national committee in Hungary. We're there. And we think of Blue Shield as a triangle set within a circle. The triangle with the 3 points of the 3 sectors is where, as put to me by an American colonel, there are no stupid questions. We all start from very different points, but we all have a similar end goal, the creation of those healthy, peaceful, stable, secure, sustainable communities. That's what goes on within the triangle, those conversations. But externally and pressing on that triangle are the issues of politics, how is cultural property going to be worked, the legal aspects, and the media aspects that I've talked about. So that's how we try and work within the Blue Shield. We get all national committees to plan to and report on 6 areas of activity. I'm not going to read them out, but they don't have to address them in this order, and they don't have to address all of them. But by having this structure, it gives a framework to the whole of the organization. And again, in a similar way, we identify 8 risks to cultural property, because it is not just damaged through collateral damage. And there are all sorts of things that can be done in peacetime to protect it. Some very recent activity that we've been doing, we were heavily involved in the clear-up after the explosion at the port in Beirut. But some of the most important work that we were involved in there was predicated on the fact that we'd been working with the Lebanese Armed Forces, LAF, the UN peacekeeping deployment, UNIFIL, and the DGA, and others in Beirut since 2013. So when we have been building a partnership and trust, when UNIFIL got permission to move out of their area of responsibility to come to Beirut, the phone went. And while we were already trying to secure all of the libraries and the museums and everything because they'd all lost all of their windows, they'd lost doors and all sorts, UNIFIL phoned and said, we know there's a lot of damage being done, how can we help? And that phone call would never have happened without 7 years of building those partnerships and peace in peacetime. So partnerships and trust in peacetime. And UNIFIL and LAF helped put on roofs of 2 key historic buildings, which without those, the buildings would have collapsed. I can tell you more about that. Very quickly, some of the stuff we do, we are working a lot with NATO, but I want to expand that to work with all other multinational forces in the Gulf Cooperation Council, in the Rio Pact, in the ASEAN Pact. All of those need to build this with the African Union. We're working with other national organizations, as you can see on the screen. We are developing work and training for peacekeepers, and next week I go to the 3rd iteration of a CPP course, a week-long course at the UN Training School in Ireland for multinational peacekeeping forces. We have built relations with the humanitarian sector and have an MOU now with the ICRC. And we're supporting the protection of cultural property and the extraction of cultural heritage workers from Afghanistan. And this is where quite a lot of our work bleeds into being completely confidential. We've been working with countries in Eastern Europe since the invasion. We're working with Ukraine on 3 particular areas: creation of a national committee, the creation of a cultural property protection capability within the military, as there should be, and in identifying whether or not there has been specific targeting of cultural property. And we've been raising awareness in other countries, as you can see there. And we're doing other work in Iraq and Syria. However, there is an enormous distance to go. We have started. I am 52 seconds over. Thank you very much indeed for listening. My apologies for going a minute over now, and thank you for listening.